If you think the Hundred Years' War between France and England is the longest war in history, you're mistaken. The Holy War, also known as the Crusades, which occurred between the Muslim world and Christianity, lasted for 2 centuries. But why? In fact, the conquest of Jerusalem and parts of Israel is not limited to the present day. It dates back to the year 1095 AD. In that year, a group of Muslims attacked Jerusalem, which is in present-day Israel, and the Eastern Roman territories that were under the control of Christians. They brought those lands under their own rule. Pope Urban II, the leader of Christians in Western Europe, declared a jihad against Muslims and called upon all Christian people, including women, men, old and young, to journey to the Middle East to reclaim Jerusalem and the occupied territories. In total, the Crusades consist of 9 wars over the course of 200 years. If you want to know the final winners of these wars between Muslims and Christians, do not miss the end of the part of the video. However, historians have put forward various reasons for the initiation of this 200-year-long war. But if you want to learn about the strange yet real reasons for starting the Crusades that have not been mentioned anywhere before, I have dedicated a video to these reasons. During the First Crusade, the Muslim Seljuk Turks controlled Jerusalem and also posed a threat to parts of Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire. In response, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos sought assistance from the Crusaders and promised to aid them in the recovery of Jerusalem if they provided help. When the Crusaders arrived in the Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Alexius welcomed them and they formed an alliance. The Crusaders then embarked on their campaign, beginning with the siege of the city of Nicaea, which was under Seljuk control. After a prolonged siege, the ruler of Nicaea surrendered, and the Crusaders fulfilled their promise by returning the city to the Byzantines. They continued their march, conquering cities such as Dorylaeum, Philimium, Heraclea, Caesarea, and Marash. Following the conquest of Marash, the Crusaders divided into 2 groups. Some lords and counts settled in the reign of Edessa, establishing the county of Edessa as a new government. The rest of the Crusaders proceeded towards Jerusalem. Notably, the Crusaded army operated without a single supreme commander, as each count led their own group of soldiers. Upon reaching Antioch, the Crusaders besieged the city, facing resistance from the Muslim Seljuks. The siege lasted for 8 months, during which the Crusaders faced difficulties due to the Seljuks' ability to obtain supplies and ammunition. Ultimately, the Crusaders launched a direct assault, and Antioch fell in June 1098 AD. There was a dispute among the Crusader commanders about who should govern Antioch and whether they should fulfill their promise to the Byzantines and hand over the city. Some argued that they should hand over the city to the Byzantines as promised, while others wanted to continue their journey and conquer Jerusalem. In the end, one of the Crusaders became the ruler of Antioch. The Byzantine ruler, who saw the untrustworthiness of Crusaders, gathered his army and returned to Constantinople. When the Crusaders eventually arrived in Jerusalem, their adversaries were not the Seljuk Turks, but a group of Muslim rulers known as the Fatimid. Before the Crusaders' arrival, the ruler of Jerusalem, the Fatimid caliphs, expelled the Christian inhabitants from the city and ordered the sealing of wells outside its wall to minimize the chances of successful siege. Despite facing limited supplies, the Crusaders launched an assault on Jerusalem, which fell after fierce resistance from the Fatimids. After the fall of Jerusalem, the Crusaders perpetrated a violent massacre, targeting both Muslims and Jews within the city. Following this event, one of the French nobles was chosen as the ruler of Jerusalem, and the Crusaders established their presence and settlements in the region. It's interesting to note that during the Second Crusade, instead of heading straight to reclaim Jerusalem, the Crusaders changed their course and went after other land, which I definitely tell you about in the following. After the First Crusade, no major war broke out among the kingdoms until the year 1144 AD, when Nureddin Zangi, the ruler of the Seljuk city of Aleppo, launched an attack on the city of Edessa and captured it. This news reached the Church and Europe through Christian pilgrims, and Pope III issued a general order for a military campaign to the east. Interestingly, there was a notable difference between this crusade and the First Crusade, and that was the presence of two European kings. In the First Crusade, there were only lords, counts, and nobles, not the European kings themselves. King Louis VII of France went to the east with 30,000 soldiers, and King Conrad III of Germany with 20,000 soldiers, both intending to join forces in the city of Nicaea. In October 1147, the German army reached Nicaea, but Conrad did not wait for Louis VII. He moved with his army towards Konya, the capital of Seljuk Emperor. However, before reaching Konya, they were attacked by the Seljuks and suffered a disastrous defeat, losing almost all of their forces. Conrad was forced to retreat to the city of Nicaea. 1 month later, Louis and his French army reached Nicaea, and Conrad III fell ill and gave his remaining 2,000 soldiers to Louis. In March 1148, Louis went to Antioch and rested there for a week before sending a letter to King Baldwin III of Jerusalem requesting his assistance. However, Baldwin was more focused on the conquest of Damascus. Eventually, Prince Antioch, King Baldwin, and Louis met in the city of Acre and reached an agreement on the main objective of the military campaign, which ultimately led to an attack on the city of Damascus. The Crusaders' army besieged Damascus for a month after reaching it, but faced attacks from Nureddin Zangi, the ruler of Aleppo, and the ruler of Mosul and their armies, resulting in heavy casualties. The Crusaders' commanders, disappointed by failure to capture Damascus, decided to retreat, and thus the Second Crusade ended with the failure of the Crusades in the conquest of Damascus. A new series of wars between Christians and Muslims began with the attack of Saladin, the ruler of the Ayyubian dynasty in Egypt. Saladin aimed to unify Muslims' rule by capturing Damascus and defeating its ruler. He established a unified government in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and with the popularity he gained among Muslims, took on the leadership of Muslims to reclaiming Jerusalem. He sent letters to all Muslims in the Middle East, calling them to jihad for the reconquest of Jerusalem. After years of struggle, Muslims achieved what they desired, with a leader like Saladin. On June 11, 1187, the Muslims' army faced the Crusaders' army in the Battle of Hattin and decisively defeated them, effectively erasing the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The King of Jerusalem was taken captive, and after half a century, Jerusalem fell back into the hands of Muslims. The news of the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe, and it stirred them up, becoming a prelude to the Third Crusade. About a week after the news reached Europe, Pope Clement III, in a historic speech, issued a public call for the Third Crusade with the aim of recapturing Jerusalem. It is necessary to mention that, at that time, the kings of England and France were at war with each other, and they couldn't send soldiers. Only the King of Rome remained, nowadays Germany, who went to war but suffered a defeat in the face of Saladin, and the King of Rome was killed. When the Pope heard this news, he personally rose and went to France and England to persuade them to set aside their wars with each other and united to start the Crusade. King Philip II of France and Richard the Lionheart set off for the Crusade, and they captured the city of Acre. At that time, Saladin was involved in a civil war and was not interested in fighting. He wanted to negotiate, offering to return all the Crusader prisoners in exchange for the Muslim prisoners in Acre. The Crusaders did not accept and demanded a heavy ransom, which Saladin refused. The Crusaders issued an order to massacre 2,500 Muslims captives in the city of Acre. What can I say to religious leaders, as most of the blame for these wars lies with them? Then Richard the Lionheart, who commanded the Christian army, conquered each city one by one and prepared to march on Jerusalem. At that time, the city of Jaffa was in the hands of the Crusaders, but Saladin launched an assault on the city and failed to enter. As a result, he entered into negotiations with Richard the Lionheart, which led to the 10-year truce of Jaffa, where Jerusalem would be for the Muslims and the city of Acre and Jaffa for the Crusaders. From there, the Third Crusade came to a halt, and Richard returned to Europe, engaging in war with France. Behold the First Crusade, where the Crusaders committed heinous crimes and atrocities that drew the condemnation of the Pope. Allow me to illuminate the reasons behind this grave censure. After the Crusaders' failure to recapture Jerusalem in the Third Crusade, Pope Innocent III issued a new call to start the Fourth Crusade. He believed that all of Christendom should make a force to reclaim Jerusalem. However, there was a problem. There were eternal conflicts in Europe, and the kingdoms of France and England were at war with each other. During the Third Crusade, when Richard the Lionheart was involved, Philip II took advantage of the situation and attacked some English territories, including Normandy. Additionally, the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, was divided between the Philip II and Otto IV, and these two were at war with each other. Pope Innocent quickly sent representatives to the European rulers engaged in war and asked them to temporarily cease hostilities. Did they listen to the Pope? Yes. They gathered together and decided not to go by land or through the Byzantine Empire, but to go by sea. However, none of the counts and lords had a fleet of ships to transport soldiers to the east. As a result, they decided to negotiate with a shipyard to secure ships. That shipyard was located in the port of Venice in northern Italy. Consequently, after several days of negotiations, the Treaty of Venice was drafted between the Crusaders and the ruler of Venice. According to this treaty, the ruler of Venice agreed to provide provisions and 200 sailing ships for the transportation of the Crusade forces for 1 year. In return, the Crusaders would pay the Venetians a sum of 20 tons of silver. With the sign of this agreement, the Crusaders set off for the eastern Mediterranean coast, while the Venetians busied themselves with preparing the ships. By April 1202, the Venetians had fulfilled their promise and prepared the ships for the Crusader army. However, contrary to the Venetians, the Crusader army was unable to fulfill its obligations. Since they couldn't arrange the entire amount they had to give to the Venetians, negotiations were reopened between the Crusaders and the ruler of Venice. They hoped to convince him to accept it in exchange for the acquisition of ships, but they were not successful. Andronicus, the ruler of Venice, realized that the Crusaders couldn't pay the remaining debt, so he made a proposal to the Crusaders' representative. He suggested that the Crusaders help the Venetians conquer the city of Zadar so that he could waive the rest of their debt. The Crusaders eagerly accepted the offer, and as a result, on November 24th, the Crusader and Venetian forces attacked and plundered the city of Zadar in Hungary. The spoils of this city ended up in the hands of the Venetians, and the Crusaders were able to obtain their ships. However, before their departure, they received a proposal that completely changed the course of the First Crusade. Alexius IV, the Byzantine prince, sent a letter to the Crusaders asking for their help. His uncle had revolted and was seeking to seize power, and the content of the letter was that if the Crusaders assisted him in reaching the throne, Alexius would reward them greatly and support them in the Crusades in the Middle East. The Crusader commanders, who had given all their wealth to the Venetians and were looking for a way to revive their fortunes, agreed. On June 24, 1203 AD, with the help of Venetian ships, Venetian and Crusader forces went to Constantinople, and after the conquest of Constantinople, the Crusaders displayed Alexius IV on the throne as promised. The new Byzantine king paid half of the amount owed to the Crusaders, and the remainder was to be paid in installments. However, for several months, Alexius did not pay his debt on time because he was forced to impose heavy taxes on the people to cover these debts, which leading to a rebellion by the people. Eventually, he fled Constantinople, and the rebels put a person named Ducas in command. Ducas had two options: either pay the remaining debt of Alexius or prepare for war himself. Well, he chose the later option. In 1204 AD, the Crusader forces once again attacked Constantinople with the help of Venetian ships. This battle lasted the entire day, and the intensity of the fighting was greater than before. Eventually, the right wing of the Crusader army succeeded in entering the city, and the Constantinople fell. After the conquest of Constantinople, the Crusader and Venetian forces spent 3 days looting the city, subjecting many women to captivity and abuse, and mercilessly killing men who resisted to protect women and children. The Crusaders' crime taking Constantinople instead of Jerusalem reached the ears of the Pope, who condemned their actions and wrote a letter to the leaders of the Crusader army, stating, "Those who were supposed to serve Christ served themselves. Those who were supposed to wield their swords against the infidels washed their sword with the blood of Christians. They disregarded the people's faith, age, or gender. They exposed nuns and elderly women to the impurities of their soldiers and openly committed immorality and adultery." After the conquest of Constantinople, a significant portion of the Byzantine Empire was divided between the Venetians and the Crusaders. The Crusaders were able to amass immense wealth, and they abandoned their plans to move towards the Middle East and capture Jerusalem. Instead, most of them remained in the Byzantine Empire's territories and established their own rule. The rest returned to Europe with the spoils they had acquired. Let's talk about the Fifth Crusade, when Pope Innocent III issued a new call for the Fifth Crusade, urging Christians to hasten. The Crusaders arrived at the port of Acre in 1217 AD and decided not to attack Jerusalem, but instead aimed to conquer Egypt. The reason behind this decision was that the forces supporting Egypt would undoubtedly reach Jerusalem, and they wanted to prevent the sending of reinforcements to Jerusalem by weakening the Ayyubids in Egypt. The Crusaders arrived in Dalmatia through the Mediterranean Sea and after several attempts finally captured the city. As the Ayyubids were engaged in their own internal conflicts, the Crusaders also took the city of Furskor. Meanwhile, additional forces from Syria and Palestine came to aid the Ayyubid ruler, Al-Kamil Muhammad, who was able to restore order and confront the Crusader army. On August 20, 1220 AD, the Ayyubid army under the command of Al-Kamil Muhammad faced the Crusader army almost 1,000 years ago. The winner of this battle was declared the ultimate victor of the Fifth Crusade and the ruler of the Egypt in history. This war lasted for hours, and due to the Ayyubids' better geographical knowledge of the region, they were able to surround the Crusader army from both sides. The Crusader commanders quickly issued order to retreat towards Damietta. However, the Ayyubids did not let them go and pursued them to the city of Damietta, besieging it. After a week-long siege of Damietta, the Crusaders requested peace and offered to return the city of Damietta and Furskor in exchange. Al-Kamil Muhammad accepted terms, and these cities were returned to the Muslim territories once again. The Crusaders considered Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire to be primarily responsible for their own defeat, because he was supposed to join the Crusader army soon but did not engage in battle. Now the blame was pointed at him by the Crusaders and the Pope. In this situation, Frederick decided to come to the Middle East to make amends. In August 1228 AD, the Crusader forces arrived at the port of Acre. Frederick devised a clever plan and decided to regain Jerusalem through negotiations with Al-Kamil Muhammad because he was aware of internal conflicts among the Ayyubids. And yes, in February 1229 AD, the Treaty of Jaffa was concluded between Al-Kamil Muhammad and Frederick. According to this treaty, Jerusalem and several other cities were handed over to Frederick. However, under special conditions, such as the Muslim residents of Jerusalem being free Muslims and retaining ownership of their homes and properties as before, and if a war broke out between Muslims and Christians, Frederick would remain neutral. Also, Frederick seemingly managed to regain Jerusalem under special conditions. When the news reached the Crusaders, they were initially overjoyed, but their laughter soon turned to anger and resentment. When the conditions became apparent to Crusader leaders, they saw this treaty as a sale of Crusader cause. They opposed it and presented it as a political trick to gain a military victory. When Frederick returned to Europe, he faced criticism and opposition from various factions and public opinions to the extent that the Pope excommunicated him. Poor Frederick. They thought he had signed this treaty for his own interest and not for the sake of Christianity. Wasn't the situation on the other side much better? Which side? The Muslim front. The Muslims were dissatisfied and angry that Al-Kamil Muhammad had immediately and without any resistance handed over Jerusalem to the Christians. When they read the conditions, they were still not satisfied. In the end, after 6 Crusades, Jerusalem finally returned to the Christians after 40 years. In 1244 AD, when the 15-year peace treaty between Christian and Muslim came to an end, Sultan Malik Saleh launched an attack on the city of Jerusalem, reclaiming it for the Muslim territories. A few months later, when the news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, a council was held in France, accompanied by Pope Innocent IV, when the command of the Crusade was handed over to King Louis IX of France. The preparations for the Crusade took 3 years. Finally, in 1248 AD, the Crusaders set off for the Middle East, and in 1249 AD, the fleets of the Crusaders headed towards Egypt. When the Crusader army reached the city of Damietta in northern Egypt, they besieged it, just like the Fifth Crusade, where they managed to capture Damietta. However, this time the situation did not escalate into the full-scale war, as the ruler of Damietta and its inhabitants evacuated the city out of fear. The situation on the Muslim front was not favorable either. Damietta fell without any resistance, and Sultan Malik Saleh was on his deathbed, raising the possibility of the civil war among the Ayyubids. In the midst of these turbulent circumstances, Louis did not miss the opportunity and marched his army towards Cairo, the capital of Egypt. However, before reaching Cairo and near the city of Mansoura, he encountered Barbars, one of the commanders of Ayyubid government. Barbars led a Turkish army consisting of Mamluks and inflicted a heavy defeat on the Crusaders. Louis and his army encamped near the city of Mansoura, waiting for a Mamluk coup to take place so that he could exploit the eternal conflicts among the Muslims. However, the situation turned out to be opposite to what Louis had anticipated. Turan the king, the son of the Malik Saleh, arrived in Egypt and allied with Barbars, and together they confronted the Crusaders. Realizing that he had no hope of the victory in the war, Louis retreated from the Battle of Damietta, and Crusaders the army attacked them before reaching the Damietta. After this battle, Turan the king and Louis, a peace treaty was concluded, according to which Damietta was returned to the Muslims, and Louis, as the initiator of the war, had to pay a sum of money as reparations to Turan the king. Thus, the Seventh Crusade ended with the defeat of the Crusaders. In the year of 1267 AD, the king of Mamluk, which had recently replaced the Ayyubids, launched raids on cities in the kingdom of Jerusalem and occupied them. They even attacked Antioch. 2 of the 4 states established during the First Crusade had already fallen. Afterward, the Pope issued the first call for the Eighth Crusade. After the call, none of the lords and kings showed interest in participating in the crusade except Louis IX of France. He sought to compensate for previous defeats and seek revenge against Muslims. His brother, Charles of Anjou, who had recently become the king of Sicily in southern Italy, was more interested in pursuing his own goals. What were those goals? I will explain later. Louis once again took the leadership of this crusade. In June 1220 AD, after preparing the army, instead of heading towards the Middle East, they went to Tunis in North Africa, which was then under the control of the Hafside Muslims. Historians have mentioned several reasons for this change in the Crusaders' road. The first reason was the insistence of French traders and merchants on Louis to move towards Tunis. Their insistence stems from the fact that years ago, a person from the Hafside court had borrowed 300,000 gold dinars from French traders for a specified period. However, when they demanded their obvious rights, they were met with denial from the Hafside Sultan and his court. As a result, they raised this issue with Louis IX and incited him to wage war against the Hafsides. The second reason was that the Hafside government used to pay an annual tribute to the Kingdom of Sicily until a few sultans refrained from paying this tribute. Therefore, Charles, the King of Sicily, declared that he would participate in this military campaign on the condition that the Crusader marched toward Tunis, so that he could once again make the Hafside government pay tribute to the Kingdom of Sicily. The final reason for the military campaign was Louis himself. On one hand, he sought to compensate for previous defeats against Muslims, and on the other hand, he did not see eye to eye with the Mamluk army. For this reason, he agreed to engage in war with the Hafside government, which considered itself the true inheritor of the Abbasid Caliphate after its fall in 1258 AD and had gained attention from the Islamic world. Louis, with the conquest of Tunis, sought to negotiate its return along with Jerusalem and the recently fallen cities from the Muslims' hand. In response, the Sultan of Hafsides, who was also referred to as a caliph of the Muslims, declared a jihad to defend against the Crusaders when he learned of their march towards Tunis. With this declaration of jihad, 50,000 forces from various parts of the Islamic world mobilized to join the defense. And with the Hafside army of 20,000 soldiers, their number reached 70,000, nearly twice the size of the 36,000 strong Crusader army. The Crusader army reached the city of Karta in northern Tunisia and encountered the Muslim army led by the Sultan. The Muslims had been expecting the arrival of the Crusader army and had blocked their pass. The two sides camped facing each other for nearly 4 months, during which they engaged in small-scale battles. However, none of these battles yielded definitive results. After 4 months, the Crusader army's provisions were running out, and Louis had to decide whether to launch a full-scale attack on the Muslim army or issue a retreat order. But before that, a plague broke out in both Crusader and Muslim armies, resulting in deaths of several soldiers from both sides, including Louis himself, the commander of the Crusader army. With the spread of the plague and both sides desiring an end to the war, a peace treaty was concluded in 1270 AD, marking the end of the Eighth Crusade. Once again, the Crusaders were forced to return to Europe without success. In 1270 AD, following the Christian peace agreement that led to the end of the Eighth Crusade, Prince Edward of England, along with his prepared forces, was ready to join Louis' army. However, when news of the peace at the end of the Eighth Crusade arrived, he headed towards the Christian land in the Middle East. On the opposing side, Baibars launched an attack towards the fortress of the Hospitaller Knights, who were considered the most powerful Christian force in the reign, and successfully took control of the fortress, followed by moving toward Tripoli and besieging the city. However, Edward's arrival in Tripoli caused Baibars to abandon the siege and retreat towards Damascus. When Edward arrived in the Middle East, he made a bold move and attacked the city of Acre, which held a special importance for both sides, successfully returning the city of the Christian territory. Nevertheless, Edward's presence in the region did not last long, as King Henry III of England passed away in 1272 AD, and Edward, his successor, had to return to England for his coronation. However, before returning to England, Edward concluded a 10-year peace treaty known as the Treaty of Caesarea with Baibars, ensuring that there would be no Muslim attacks on Christian cities for the next decades. In 1289 AD, 17 years after the peace between Edward and Baibars, Mansur, Baibars' successor and the Sultan of the Mamluks, launched an attack on the city of Tripoli, resulting in its fall and the collapse of the county of Tripoli. Now the only Christian kingdom remaining in the reign was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was spending its final years. After the fall of Tripoli, Mansur spent a year preparing a powerful army for the conquest of remaining Christian cities. However, before the attack in 1290 AD, Mansur passed away, and his son Ashraf Khalil took command of these forces for the assault on Jerusalem. On the other side, all the knights and the Crusader forces gathered in the city of Acre to find a way to halt the advance of the Mamluks. Although they managed to resist for a month against the powerful Mamluk army, the city of Acre eventually fell. After the conquest of Acre, the remaining Christian cities of the Kingdom of Jerusalem fell one by one into the hands of Ashraf Khalil. The last remnants of the Christian in the Middle East collapsed after 2 centuries. The epic saga of the Crusades, ignited by Pope Urban's impassioned plea for the liberation of the Jerusalem in 1095 AD, reached its dramatic conclusion in 1291 AD with the resounding defeat of the Crusaders. For nearly 2 centuries, knights clad in armor and driven by unwavering faith battled across the Middle East lands, seeking to reclaim the Holy City.